There are several reasons why the 1-minute reprimand works so well. To begin with, the manager explained, the feedback in the 1-minute reprimand is immediate. That is, you got to the individual as soon as you observe the misbehavior or your data information system tips you off. It's not appropriate to gunny sack or save up negative feelings about someone's poor performance. The fact that the feedback is so immediate is an important lesson in why the 1-minute reprimand works so well. Unless discipline occurs as close to the misbehavior as possible, it tends not to be as helpful in influencing future behavior. Most managers are gunny sack discipliners. That is, they store up observations of poor behavior, and then someday when performance review comes, or they're angry in general because the sack is so full, they charge in and dump everything on the table. They tell people all the things they've done wrong for the last few weeks or months or more. The young man breathed a deep sigh and said, "So true." And then, the 1-minute manager went on, the manager and subordinate usually end up yelling at each other about the facts or simply keeping quiet and resenting each other. The person receiving the feedback doesn't really hear what he or she has done wrong. This is a version of the leave-alone zap form of discipline that I've spoken about earlier. "I remember it well," responded the young man. "That's certainly something I want to avoid." "Absolutely," agreed the manager. If managers would only intervene early, they could deal with one behavior at a time, and the person receiving the discipline wouldn't be overwhelmed. They could hear the feedback. That's why I think performance review is an ongoing process, not something you do only once a year. So, one reason that the 1-minute reprimand works is that the person receiving the reprimand can hear the feedback, because when the manager deals with one behavior at a time, it seems more fair and clear, the young man summarized. "Yes," the manager said. "And secondly, when I give a 1-minute reprimand, I never attack a person's worth or value as a person. Since their okayness as a person is not up for grabs, they don't feel they have to defend themselves. I reprimand the behavior only. Thus, my feedback and their own reaction to it is about the specific behavior and not their feelings about themselves as human beings. So often, when disciplining people, managers persecute the individual. My purpose in a 1-minute reprimand is to eliminate the behavior and keep the person." "So that's why you make the second half of the reprimand appraising," the young man said. "Their behavior is not okay, they are okay." "Yes," agreed the 1-minute manager. "Why wouldn't you give the praising first and then the reprimand?" suggested the young man. "For some reason, it just doesn't work," insisted the manager. "Some people, now that I think of it, say that I am nice and tough as a manager. But to be more accurate, I'm really tough and nice." "Tough and nice," echoed the young man. "Yes," insisted the 1-minute manager. "This is an old philosophy that has worked well for literally thousands of years. There is in fact a story in ancient China that illustrates this. Once upon a time, an emperor appointed a second in command. He called this prime minister in and, in effect, said to him, "Why don't we divide up the tasks? Why don't you do all the punishing and I'll do all the rewarding?" The prime minister said, "Fine, I'll do all the punishing and you do all the rewarding." "I think I'm going to like this story," the young man said. You will," the 1-minute manager replied with a knowing smile. "Now this emperor," the manager continued, "soon noticed that whenever he asked somebody to do something, they might do it or they might not do it. However, when the prime minister spoke, people moved. So the emperor called the prime minister back in and said, "Why don't we divide the tasks again? You've been doing all the punishing here for quite a while. Now let me do the punishing and you do the rewarding." So the prime minister and the emperor switched roles again. And within a month, the prime minister was emperor. The emperor had been a nice person, rewarding and being kind to everyone. Then he started to punish people. People said, "What's wrong with that old codger?" And they threw him out on his ear. When they came to look for a replacement, they said, "You know who's really starting to come around now? The prime minister." So they put him right into office. "Is that a true story?" the young man asked. "Who cares?" said the 1-minute manager, laughing. "Seriously," he added, "I do know this. If you are first tough on the behavior and then supportive of the person, it works. Do you have any modern-day examples of where the 1-minute reprimand has worked other than in management? The young man asked the wise manager. Yes, certainly, the manager said. Let me mention two. One with severe adult behavior problems and another in disciplining children. What do you mean when you say severe adult behavior problems? The young man asked. I'm talking about alcoholics in particular, the manager answered. About 30 years ago, an observant clergyman discovered a technique which is now called crisis intervention. He made the discovery when he was helping a physician's wife. She was in a Minnesota hospital in critical condition and slowly dying from cirrhosis of the liver. But she was still denying that she had a drinking problem. When all her family had gathered at her bedside, the clergyman asked each of them to describe specific drinking incidents they had observed. That's an important part of the 1-minute reprimand. Before giving a reprimand, you have to see the behavior yourself. You can't depend on what someone else saw. You never give a reprimand based on hearsay. Interesting, the young man broke in. Let me finish. After the family described specific behaviors, the clergyman asked each of the family members to tell the woman how they felt about those incidents. Gathered closely around her, one by one they told her first what she did, and second how they felt about it. They were angry, frustrated, embarrassed. And then they told her how much they loved her, and they instinctively touched her and gently said how they wanted her to live and to enjoy life once again. That was why they were so angry with her. That sounds so simple, said the young man, especially with something as complicated as a drinking problem. Did it work? Amazingly so, the 1-minute manager insisted. And now there are crisis intervention centers all over the country. It's not as simple as I've summarized it, of course. But these three basic ingredients, telling people what they did wrong, telling people how you feel about it, and reminding people that they are valuable and worthwhile, lead to significant improvements in people's behavior. That's nothing short of incredible, the young man said. I know it is, the manager agreed. You said you'd give me 2 examples of how other people successfully use methods like the 1-minute reprimand, the young man said. Yes, of course. In the early 1970s, a family psychiatrist in California also made the same amazing discovery with children. He had read a lot about bonding, the emotional ties people have to people. He knew what people needed. People need to be in contact with people who care about them, to be accepted as valuable just because they are people. The doctor also knew that people need to have a spade called a spade, to be pulled up short by people who care when they're not behaving well. How does that translate, the young man wanted to know, into practical action? Each parent is taught to physically touch their child by putting their hand on the child's shoulder, touching his arm, or if he is young, actually sitting the child in their lap. Then the parent tells the child exactly what he did wrong and how their parent feels about it, and in no uncertain terms. You can see that this is very like what the family members did for the sick woman. Finally, the parent takes a deep breath and allows for a few seconds of silence so the child can feel whatever the parent is feeling. Then the parent tells the youngster how valuable and important the child is to the parent. You see, it's very important when you're managing people to remember that behavior and worth are not the same things. What is really worthwhile is the person managing their own behavior. This is as true of each of us as managers as it is of each of the people we're managing. In fact, if you know this, the manager said as he pointed to one of his favorite plaques, you will know the key to a really successful reprimand. We are not just our behavior. We are the person managing our behavior. If you realize that you're managing people and not just their recent behavior, the manager concluded, you'll do well. It sounds like there's a lot of caring and respect behind such a reprimand, the young man said. I'm glad you noticed that, young man. You'll be successful with the 1-minute reprimand when you really care about the welfare of the person you're reprimanding. That reminds me, the young man injected. Mr. Levy told me that you pat him on the shoulder or shake hands or some other way make contact with him during appraising. And now I notice that the parents are encouraged to touch their children during the scolding. Is touching an important part of the 1-minute praisings and reprimands? Yes and no, the manager answered with a smile. Yes, if you know the person well and are clearly interested in helping the person to succeed in his or her work. And no, if you or the other person has any doubts about that. Touch is a very powerful message, the manager pointed out. People have strong feelings about being touched, and that needs to be respected. Would you, for instance, like someone whose motives you weren't sure of to touch you during a praising or a reprimand? No, the young man answered clearly. I really wouldn't. You see what I mean, the manager explained. Touch is very honest. People know immediately when you touch them whether you care about them or whether you're just trying to find a new way to manipulate them. There's a very simple rule about touching, the manager continued. When you touch, don't take. Touch the people you manage only when you're giving them something. Reassurance, support, encouragement, whatever. So you should refrain from touching someone, the young man said, until you know them and they know you're interested in their success, that you're clearly on their side. I can see that. But, the young man said hesitantly, while the 1-minute praisings and the 1-minute reprimands look simple enough, aren't they really just powerful ways for you to get people to do what you want them to do? And isn't that manipulative? You're right about 1-minute management being a powerful way to get people to do what you want them to do, the manager confirmed. However, manipulation is getting people to do something they are either not aware of or don't agree to. That's why it's so important to let each person know up front what you're doing and why. It's like anything else in life, the manager explained. There are things that work and things that don't work. Being honest with people eventually works. On the other hand, as you've probably learned in your own life, being dishonest eventually leads to a failing with people. It's just that simple. I can see now, the young man said, where the power of your management style comes from. You care about people. Yes, the manager said simply. I guess I do. The young man remembered how gruff he thought this special manager was when he first met him. It was as though the manager could read his mind. Sometimes, the 1-minute manager said, you have to care enough to be tough. And I am. I'm very tough on the poor performance, but only on the performance. I'm never tough on the person. The young man liked the 1-minute manager. He knew now why people liked to work with him. Maybe you'd find this interesting, sir, the younger man said as he pointed to his notebook. It's a plaque I've created to remind me of how goals, the 1-minute goals, and consequences, the praisings and the reprimands, affect people's behavior. Goals begin behaviors. Consequences maintain behaviors. That's very good, the manager exclaimed. Do you think so? The young man asked, wanting to hear the compliment once again. Young man, the manager said very slowly for emphasis, it is not my role in life to be a human tape recorder. I do not have time to continually repeat myself. Just when he thought he would be praised, the young man felt he was in for another 1-minute reprimand, something he wanted to avoid. The bright young man kept a straight face and said simply, What? They looked at each other for only a moment, and then they both burst into laughter. I like you, young man, the manager said. How would you like to go to work here? The young man put down his notebook and stared in amazement. You mean go to work for you? He asked enthusiastically. No, I mean go to work for yourself, like the other people in my department. Nobody ever really works for anybody else. I just help people work better, and in the process, they benefit our organization. This was, of course, what the young man had been looking for all along. I'd love to work here, he said. And so he did, for some time. The time the special manager had invested in him paid off, because eventually, the inevitable happened. He became a 1-minute manager. He became a 1-minute manager not because he thought like one or talked like one, but because he behaved like one. He set 1-minute goals. He gave 1-minute praisings. He gave 1-minute reprimands. He asked brief, important questions, spoke the simple truth, laughed worked, and enjoyed. And perhaps most of all, he encouraged the people he worked with to do the same. He had even created a pocket-sized game plan to make it easier for the people around him to become one-minute managers. He had given it as a useful gift to each person who reported to him.